You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 13th of March 2025 on Monocle Radio.
President Vladimir Putin of Russia agrees to a ceasefire in Ukraine, or does he? The latest exchanges in the United States versus the world trade war, and the real reason you might not be able to get a table. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests John Everard and Carole Walker will discuss the day's big stories, and our weekly letter from is postmarked Hong Kong. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by John Everard, former British ambassador to Belarus, Uruguay and North Korea, and by Carole Walker, Times radio presenter and political commentator. Hello to you both.
Hello. Yeah, good evening.
Carole, you have recently controversially been to Venice. I say controversially in tones of leaden sarcasm there. It's about the least controversial place people could go. It's delightful. What were you up to there exactly?
Actually, I hadn't been for about 30 years, so I went for a long weekend with my husband, and actually it was wonderful to go in February, out of season. Amazingly, we didn't have the fog for which you can get a lot in Venice, but we had clear blue skies and sunshine, quite cold. We had some good recommendations for lots of places off the beaten track. And I have to say that, I mean, it was just truly magical. Of course there are tourists there. There's always tourists there. But it is such a stunning place, so steeped in history. And it's one of those cities that you go to and you're still struck by the extraordinary grandeur of these palaces coming straight out of the water. And yeah, it was absolutely delightful.
I always think of the meeting at which some obviously insane Italian prince pitched to his Italian prince mates the idea of building a city of palaces in a swamp, and somehow everybody, who I assume initially said, with you on the city of palaces, but why don't we build that here on land? And he obviously insisted, no, we must build it in the swamp, and eventually everyone went, okay, fine, that's what we're doing.
Not just that, but they poured these phenomenal amounts of money into being able to actually build it on the swamp and laying all the wood into the swamp onto which they could build the palaces, and then building some of the most sumptuous palaces that existed in that era. And the basilica, which is still just absolutely stunning, beautifully preserved. And if you pre-book it, you can just walk in and wander around, certainly in February, and just be stunned by its beauty.
I have only been to Venice once myself, and it was in the off-season, which I do obviously recommend. John, meanwhile, you have been visiting the Venice of East Anglia.
Cromer on the coast, perhaps slightly less exotic than Venice, but pretty...
No less beautiful in its own way.
Thank you. I'm glad you came in and said that. Absolutely. Lovely place. Well out of season. The reason that Cromer is out of season in February and March is because the wind comes straight off the North Sea and blows through any amount of clothing. It's quite a cooling place. But nevertheless, splendidly desolate, lots of seagulls wandering around, and some lovely beaches.
And I grew up... Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, no, that's perfectly fine. Would you like to confess to the reasons you were enthusing about Cromer over there?
Well, I did grow up very close to there. I go there all the time. I went to school in Cromer. We used to have my school speech days in the little tiny theatre on the end of the pier. And it is a little seaside resort that still has, I think, quite a bit of authenticity and traditional charm about it, despite the fact that it's got some quite nice coffee shops.
Great Nescov and great crabs. Here ends this broadcast on behalf of the Chroma.
We will now pivot seamlessly from Chroma to Russia, where President Vladimir Putin has said that he is in favour of the 30-day ceasefire proposed earlier this week by Ukraine and the United States. And as Vladimir Putin's word is famously something you can take to the bank, and given that Russia is renowned for approaching all negotiations in the heartiest good faith, the problem would now appear to be solved. Unless, and hear us out, it isn't. Putin attached to his enthusiasm a rider that any such ceasefire should lead to enduring peace and this might just be the tricky bit, remove, as he put it, underlying causes of the crisis, upon which opinions may differ. Joining us first of all is the political risk analyst Charles Hecker, author of Zero Sum, the Arc of International Business in Russia. He joins us from somewhere in Florida. Charles, the big question first, as far as it's ever possible to tell with Vladimir Putin, is he in favour of a ceasefire or is he not?
No, he is not. He says that he is because he doesn't want to anger President Trump. But the ceasefire arrangement, such as it stands now, does not tick any of the boxes that Putin is looking for in his agreement to end the war on Ukraine. What he's doing is he's delaying. He's going to try to attach additional conditionality to the ceasefire that it doesn't currently have. And this is a stalling tactic.
So is it fair to say that what he is doing now is rejecting the ceasefire proposal while trying very hard not to look like he's rejecting the ceasefire proposal?
Yeah, I think that's right. He's trying to walk an extremely fine diplomatic line. And what he wants to do essentially is keep talks going so that he looks as if he is a willing participant in these negotiations. But we know what his criteria are for a longer-term settlement. And until those criteria are met, there is absolutely no reason for Putin to agree to anything that has been put in front of him so far.
Well, this is where we come to that rather loaded-looking phrase, underlying causes, because as far as it's possible to tell, once you boil away everything else, as far as Vladimir Putin is concerned, the underlying cause of this war is that Ukraine exists.
That's right. And so, look, there's no way that President Putin anticipates that he's going to make it militarily to Kiev. That's just not going to happen, and he knows that. There is still room in his mind for him to make additional military gains on the ground, but the rest of this will come in negotiations. And remember that one of the points that Putin wants to negotiate are elections in Ukraine. And what Putin can't achieve militarily, he will try to achieve politically. And so you can bet that if and when there are elections in Ukraine, Russia is going to put its thumb mightily on that scale to try to influence the outcome in a way that is favorable to Russia.
I did want to run by a couple of his other nuances. I wanted to run those by you. He does dangle the possibility of restoring to European markets cheap Russian energy. Is he right in assessing that there might be an audience for that in Europe right now?
Yeah, that's right. There is, surprisingly or otherwise, there is an appetite for Russian gas in Europe, even though Russian gas and any sort of dependency on Russian energy will be weaponized by Russia. We have heard from the European Union that they are prepared to buy more gas. And this is, they think, for two reasons. The first is in the hopes of bringing Putin closer to the negotiating table. And then, of course, this helps keep energy prices down in a politically volatile Europe. So, yes, the energy question is back on the table, and both sides appear willing to talk about it.
And Charles, just finally, he did have a number of follow-up questions, as indeed do we all, but they were about who would assess violations of any ceasefire, how would they respond to any such violations, what would the deal be with Ukrainian rearmament and regrouping during a ceasefire. Are these actually the fair enough questions that they do appear to be on the surface, or is the point that we can't actually tell whether he thinks these are fair enough questions that he actually wants answers to, or whether he is just stalling?
A little bit of both, Andrew. I mean, one of the things that Putin doesn't like about the ceasefire arrangement is that if the United States continues its military support for Ukraine, then Ukraine will have the opportunity to rearm. That's assuming that the ceasefire only lasts 30 days, and then Ukraine and Russia resume hostilities. I guess the biggest concern for Putin really is that this is a rolling ceasefire that goes for 30 days and another 30 days and another 30 days and doesn't achieve any of his political objectives.
Charles Hecker, thank you for joining us. Listening to that, of course, were our panellists John Everard and Carole Walker, who we will bring back in now. John, first of all, every Ukrainian who has been following today's developments, and I suspect that most Ukrainians have been, will be trying to figure out one key thing, which is, does any of this make it any more or less likely that Ukraine is about to be thrown under the bus by the United States?
And they will all come to the conclusion, we don't know. Whether Ukraine gets thrown under the bus depends entirely on Trump's reaction to what Putin has said in public and to what Russian officials are telling US officials right now. I mean, Vikov is in Moscow talking not to Putin, it turns out, but to very senior officials. If Putin, as Charles Eckers just said, tries hard to stall the ceasefire, either Trump says, yeah, OK, you have a reasonable point, we need to talk, in which case Putin essentially has won, he can spin this out and keep fighting, keep pushing slowly forward in Ukraine. Or he can say, no, back up his Secretary of State. Marco Rubio said he wants a ceasefire in the next few days. Ceasefire first, then we talk about the details. The point of a ceasefire is that you have an opening then for serious negotiations about the long-term peace that you, Vladimir Vladimirovich, say you're so fond of. And if you do not agree to a ceasefire, then I will do the most horrible things to what? Your economy? I could do financial things, says President Trump. But as Rubio has pointed out, Russia is already heavily sanctioned. There's not a lot to do in there. Mm-hmm. So if he wants to force Putin into a ceasefire, obviously against his will at this point, he is going to have to do something else. And the big question is, what might that something else be?
Well, to put to you, Carole, a variation on that question, which will be the thing that is now preoccupying European leaders, is, are we any clearer on whose side the United States is ultimately on here?
Well, I think that will depend on how President Trump responds to this opening salvo from President Putin, because it was an opening salvo of questions. He said, if there's a ceasefire, who's going to ensure the security? Who's going to police it? Who's going to ensure that it is not breached? Now, in a sense, we've already had some of what Putin thinks about that, because his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has said, well, it's certainly not going to be any NATO troops. And that doesn't just mean a NATO force. That means any troops from NATO countries, even if they're under a different flag or wearing a different helmet. And the US have said, well, they're not really going to be doing the security guarantees. It's over to Europe. So that already puts up a huge stumbling block.
I mean, it's asking a lot of Ireland and Austria.
Indeed, a great deal. A great deal. And from the outset, of course, the reason or the pretext which President Putin gave for his invasion of Ukraine was essentially because he felt that it was threatening Russia, that NATO was coming closer to his doorstep. So Putin clearly here is playing for time, and I think testing where Donald Trump really is. And he knows that even before we got to this stage, Donald Trump gave President Putin a huge amount of what he wants. He said, oh, yeah, well, Ukraine's going to have to give up territory. And, Ukraine can't pose a threat to Russia and a whole host of other things. So Putin probably thinks he's got Trump on his side. He's come back with just enough positive signals to prevent Donald Trump flouncing off in a fury and to suggest, yes, of course I'm on the same page as President Trump. We want a lasting peace. But he hasn't given an inch.
Other developments in the last day or two, John. Russia is now claiming to have retaken most of Kursk Oblast. This was the small chunk of Russia that the Ukrainians seized some months ago. the two questions attached to that are, is that actually going to be a significant advantage? Because it would appear to deprive Ukraine of a bargaining chip if indeed they have lost that territory. And is there a possibility that Russia was essentially gifted that by the United States pausing intelligence sharing and weapons supplies to Ukraine, brief though that pause was?
Yes and yes. The loss of the Russian territory held by Ukraine will complicate the Ukrainian position in any negotiations. They had very much hoped to be able to use that as a bargaining chip, territory for territory, to agree for a deeper Russian withdrawal from areas currently controlled by Russia. And yes, quite a lot of the territory in the Kursk Oblast has been seized by Russia or retaken by Russia in the last 48 hours. They had a big push at a time when, of course, the Ukrainian troops were blinded, that they couldn't access data or satellite imagery. Incidentally, a lot of the fighting there being done not by Russian troops but by North Koreans. Mm-hmm. They've proved crucial in this whole thing.
And just taking this back to Europe, Carole, do you get any sense at all that Europe's nerves generally are jangling any more or less right now than they were perhaps this time last week? Because another development breaking today is that Poland has formally and indeed publicly asked, which is how we know it, the United States to deploy American nuclear weapons on Polish territory. That doesn't sound like the act of a continent, or at least one country, that is relaxing at all.
I think Europe will be just as nervous tonight, as it was yesterday, or ever since President Putin's illegal invasion more than 3 years ago. I think countries like Poland know that they can't trust Putin. That's why there's been so much of a focus on a potential peacekeeping force, this coalition of the willing, which the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer is holding another meeting to try to get together at the weekend. They know that President Putin has given undertakings in the past. We saw the agreement after the invasion in 2014. That simply fell apart after a few years, and he came back and took another chunk of Ukraine's territory. It's almost certain that President Putin, as these negotiations continue, if indeed that is the way this process does unfold, is going to include President Putin insisting that he has full control of those 4 regions of Ukraine which he has illegally claimed for his own and which he partially occupies. And I think that Europe will be very, very wary of any deal that leaves Putin in potentially an even more powerful position than he was before he invaded 3 years ago.
And finally on this, John, and prevailing on your expertise with having danced the diplomatic dance for a living, if in the arguably unlikely event that you walked out of here and the next call you had on your phone was from Secretary of State Marco Rubio asking, what should I do next? What would you advise him?
Get straight on the phone to your president and tell him, hang tough, don't let Putin get away with this. We have nailed our colours to the mast. We have talked about a ceasefire now. The Ukrainians have come on board. It took a bit of shoving, but they're on board. We must get the Russians on board. Tell Putin, ceasefire now or else.
Well, on a related front, let's now move on to the United States' ongoing trade war with the world. Or for those listening to this on podcast after the live broadcast, don't blame us if President Donald Trump has changed his mind about everything again by the time you hear this. As of right now, at least, Trump is threatening to up the ante on tariffs imposed by the EU, Canada and others on American goods in response to the tariffs imposed by the United States on theirs. Judging by today's social media postings, Trump is enraged to all caps levels by the EU's 50% tariff on American whiskey, to which Trump is threatening to respond with a 200% tariff on all European wine and other alcoholic beverages. In a just world, being condemned to Californian Zinfandel would be what pushed Americans to a second revolution against a mad king. That, I guess, or tripling the price of Guinness the week before St. Patrick's Day. But Carole, has he rather undermined himself when making these threats with all his previous reversals? There have literally been days when American markets have had to calibrate the impact of tariffs by not even by the day or the week, but by the hour.
Yeah, I mean, there were a few hours earlier this week when the tariffs on some goods coming from Canada went up from 25% to 50% and then back again within an hour or so. And for producers, traders and people who are actually trying to do their business during all of this, it has been an absolute roller coaster. And the US markets have been on a roller coaster. Now, Donald Trump has said, well, this is all just part of the short-term volatility, and it's all going to come out and work out really well for US producers. He thinks that this threat of 200% on European Union wines is going to be great for the Californian Zinfandel industry and other producers. But I think it's very difficult indeed to see where any of this ends up helping American voters, for example. I was talking to a trade expert in Canada last night who was pointing out that, for example, there are farmers who send their produce over the border into the United States to have the meat processed. It comes back to be packaged. It comes back again into the United States to be further dispersed. And the strong likelihood that at each stage along that, they could pick up a 25% tariffs, and it's going to end up with sausages being sold to American voters costing a huge amount more than they did a week ago. So I think that Donald Trump is on a very dangerous course here. I've yet to speak to an economist who thinks that these trade wars are actually going to benefit the US economy in the long term. But this was what Donald Trump was elected on. He said he was going to do this. He talked about his love of tariffs. He talked about protecting US industry. So perhaps, once again, I've underestimated Donald Trump.
I mean, China has also been, in particular, on the receiving end of these, John. And if we look at China and Asia more broadly, are we getting any sense yet that Asian countries are starting to talk sort of amongst themselves along the lines of, like, look, we're going to have to put up with at least another 3.5 years of this. We might have to come up with alternative arrangements. Should we be maybe trading more with each other, etc.?
No, that would be too much to hope for. I mean, peace and love breaking out in Asia, hey, if only. The Japanese and the South Koreans have been talking to each other. The South Koreans, of course, hit very heavily by the tariffs on steel. South Korea exports a lot of steel to the United States. The Japanese had special negotiated talks with the Americans just 2 days ago, pointing out that Japan invests huge amounts in the United States, creating a lot of American jobs, and it had rather hoped for better treatment than this from its major ally, to which, of course, the Americans guffawed and slapped another tariff on because that's what they like to do. But coordination between the Asians, I don't see it. China, in particular, is quite clearly determined to plough its own furrow. It regards itself as an exceptional country, and probably quite rightly, it regards itself as the real target of the tariff war. I quite believe Xi Jinping when he says that China will fight the United States to the last, whether it's over tariffs or in any other way. This could get nasty.
On the subject of things which could get nasty, Carole, the foreign ministers of the G7 are supposed to be meeting in Quebec, of all places, very shortly. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, will be attending. He has said it is not a meeting about how we're going to take over Canada, which does sound like the sort of thing you would say if it was. But Canada's Foreign Minister Melanie Joly has said if the US can do this to us, their closest friend, nobody is safe. Is she sort of channeling the rest of the G7 there and indeed the rest of the planet at this point?
Well, look, I think the Trump effect on Canada's politics has been fascinating because there was disbelief and then absolute outrage in Canada at President Trump's suggestion that Canada could be made an additional member of the United States of America. But there is some pretty strong anti-US sentiment there now. It is astonishing the way that has benefited the Liberal Party. We've just had a former governor of the British Bank of England, Mark Carney, replacing the outgoing Justin Trudeau as leader of the party, of a party that's gone from being way behind in the polls to likely to win a general election that will be called fairly shortly. But I don't quite understand why President Trump thinks it's a good idea to get into such a furious economic and political battle with its nearest neighbour and long-term ally, Canada, because the two countries have such close links. I was talking about the trading links a moment ago. Their two economies are so closely entwined. And given that the US doesn't want to get involved in so many of these foreign wars, it needs its allies. And it seems to be going out of its way under President Trump to alienate those that it could have relied on. And of course, it could have had its right-wing candidate potentially as the next leader of Canada, but has so enraged the people of Canada that now looks very unlikely that it's going to happen. So I'm not quite sure that I see the overall strategy from President Trump in this one. But well, look, again, maybe I'm underestimating. There is some a cunning plan here that is not quite as obvious as I might think.
Just finally on this one, John, and again, we prevail on your expertise in practicing diplomacy on the subject of alienating allies. Towards the end of his blurt on social media today about wanting to tariff the bejeebers out of everybody else's drinks, he made a reference to how this would be great news for, and I quote, champagne businesses in the United States. Now, ambassadors have been summoned for less than that, right?
They have champagne businesses in the United States. Trump has said that what he's trying to do...
Even John's lost for words.
Choking on the thought of American champagne. I'm still trying to sort of expunge the thought of California's Infantile. Trump has said that he wants people to make things, build things actually in the United States, create American jobs. I suppose the logical conclusion is he wants us to make French wine in America. My mind is boggling. To make champagne in America? I'm sorry. At this point, my circuit's just fused.
I'm actually both surprised and disappointed that the French have not asked for the Statue of Liberty back since that post was broadcast.
I just did want to throw in that the other significant fact in all of this, of course, is that Eric Trump, one of the president's children, actually owns and is president of a vineyard in Charlottesville, Virginia, called, funnily enough, the Trump Winery. And it sells a variety of wines such as the Presidential Reserve Inaugural Edition. This, of course, is a sparkling wine. Obviously, it's not champagne.
I'm sure this is entirely coincidental.
It does cost $250, but this is probably a totally irrelevant fact. But I just thought it might be interesting for the audience to know about that.
Well, now to an apparent repudiation of the idea that the customer is always right. It has been reported in The Times that among upscale restaurants in London, lists are kept and circulated of customers who are persistently irritating, and that those customers may therefore be struggling to make a reservation. Among the peeves cited by aggrieved hash slingers are overt social media posers, bad review threateners, no-showers, parsimonious orderers, and people who are rude to waiting staff. It must earnestly be hoped that patrons who let their ghastly children watch films on tablets without headphones are edging up this list. Carole, this is fair enough, isn't it? I mean, if you are the proprietor of an establishment, within the bounds of law, you are entitled to make decisions about who darkens your doorstep and who doesn't.
Well, whatever happened to the customer is always right? I mean, we're talking here about...
The customer always isn't. The customer is, and I did my stint in shops. The customer is sometimes a massive jerk.
Yeah, they can be pretty unpleasant, but isn't that what you've got your restaurant for? Look, this is a very posh restaurant in West London that I have to say I've never been to. And I think that there does seem to be this trend amongst these posh eateries, which I don't really tend to go to unless there's somebody else who happens to offer to take me there. No.
Spoken like a journalist, Carole. Well done.
Absolutely. There are, of course, times when in the interests of journalism you do have to accept these things. And these kind of establishments where you go in and you are immediately made to feel that you should really be honoured to be allowed to cross the threshold. And if you dared to mention the fact that actually, like in my case, you don't actually actually eat meat. It's seen as an absolute affront to the chef. I mean, really, I think some of these chefs have found that maybe the fame has got a little bit too much to their heads, and maybe they've had just too many customers with very fat wallets who want to show that they've got very fat wallets and are prepared to pay their extortionate prices and put up with their attitudes. And I'm not sure that I am.
Yeah, John, I am no fan myself of the snooty restaurant, but also I am no fan of a failure to observe basic standards of adult behaviour, which is something you see a lot in the non-snooty restaurants I tend to patronise. So that being the case, would it not be arguably a better world if, in fact, more restaurants, not just the snooty ones, did this? If more restaurants felt empowered to say to patrons, that's not how you behave in here, either wind your neck in or you're out?
We probably eat in different restaurants. I mean, the ones that I patronise, and I'm not a great restaurant goer, do exactly that. I mean, if you start to misbehave, sort of somebody in a large leather jacket emerged from the back room and asked you to depart immediately, sir, and in a way that suggests that failure to comply with this invitation might...
Do you eat a lot of eel and mash in the East End, do you?
Absolutely. Pig out on the stuff with liquor on top. Hey, what's not to like? But coming back to Carole's point, I have to say that done properly, this attitude of, never mind the customer being king, this is my restaurant, I own it, and I will let you in only if you're very, very good. It does wonders for your income because word quickly gets around that to get into, I don't know, a certain restaurant, you've got to be on the list, and you can go around dropping into dinner parties for weeks afterwards, and of course you are allowed to eat in this place, look around the table, and of course everybody's trying to pretend that they've got a spot on the scene they have to examine because they aren't. They haven't made the grade.
So it's all a cunning business strategy.
Oh, absolutely. There was a restaurant in Paris in the 1920s, I can't remember its name, who had a strategy that ordinary customers were allowed to eat on the table sort of around the edge of the restaurant. And the summum bonum, the thing that everybody aimed for, was to be allowed to eat in the little table right in the middle of the restaurant. And people would almost kill for this privilege. And of course, they doubled, trebled their prices, and people still came.
See, I want to close by briefly appointing you both the proprietor of your own snooty restaurant and ask you to lay down some laws here about what you would and would not put up with. Because I wasn't kidding earlier when I talked about what strikes me increasingly as an accelerating breakdown in just basic standards of acting like a grown-up in public. I'm not making this story up. People always assume I am, but I'm not. Within the last year, while dining at a restaurant in the United States, I was with my two companions in one particular booth because they have those nice booths that you often have in American restaurants. In the next booth, a couple sat down, and when their meal arrived, one produced his phone, propped it up between them, and they put a film on and watched it in the restaurant. Now, see, if I'm running that place, they are both heading headfirst down the stairs with the waiter's boot print in the seat of their trousers.
I think that you've now just raised this kind of scenario, which is making me think. But look, what is wrong with just having a sign up? We respectfully ask customers to put their telephones away and enjoy our food as they come in. Can't they just do that without laying down the law? I'm in the kind of live and let live approach to all of this.
Really? No, I want to see people thrown down staircases.
I'm all in favour of children being brought out to restaurants from a very young age. I don't actually mind them tearing around the tables, but I would draw the line at them, watching a video without headphones. So that's where I would draw the line.
John, what about you? Are you keeping under the front counter a supply of ties to impose on the tieless?
I think any restaurant which asks for a proprietor and with my cooking, I don't think customers would be a problem. I'd be sitting there staring at empty tables, or maybe one or two who come in for that experimental first meal and sort of lie groaning in absolute agony under the table at the end of the meal.
You'd have the bouncers out the front throwing people in.
That's right. That would be a good strategy. Absolutely right.
Carole Walker and John Everard, thank you for joining us. Finally, on today's show, our weekly letter from is about the many changes to Hong Kong. Here's Twiggy Young on a return to her hometown for Lunar New Year.
Dubbed the intersection of East and West, Hong Kong is part of China, yet still distinct from it. This city has its own language, its own currency, and a separate political system. For the longest time, I have been truly proud of the unique identity this place has given me. This is my first home visit in 2 years, and my first time celebrating Lunar New Year here in 5. I'm excited, but also somewhat apprehensive. I am in Monocle, a major shopping district where I used to hang out with friends. Like always, the streets are packed, illuminated by bright signboards stacked at varying heights. As I weave through the crowds, something immediately stands out. Groups of Mandarin speakers dominating the streets, and a number of posters in simplified Chinese. In case you don't know, Cantonese is our primary language, and we write in traditional Chinese characters. Now, it seems to be less of the norm.
要杯凍檸茶同埋碎牛治啊唔該。
That was me ordering an iced lemon tea and corned beef sandwich in a 茶餐廳, or Hong Kong-style cafe, a restaurant that serves a unique fusion of Western and Cantonese cuisine. Sandwiches might seem basic, but any Hong Kongers would agree. You can never quite replicate them at home. And yes, the corned beef sandwich is still the premium choice. The atmosphere brings back memories of my school days, as it always offers a good deal to students. It has all the iconic Hong Kong dishes and beverages you can think of. Pineapple buns, egg tarts, and of course my usual order, the iced lemon tea, served in a glass with actual lemon slices ready to be poked to taste. Scanning the menu, I'm surprised. Not just by the inflated prices, but by something else, the hand-crushed lemon tea. My go-to drink's Chinese counterpart is served in a restaurant seen as a Hong Kong cultural symbol. This Chinese alternative has taken off in Hong Kong. I'm aware, but never expected it to reach this level. The next day, I got onto a tram. Not one of those sleek, fully air-conditioned light rail trams, but a classic double-decker, the kind that offers a laid-back journey through the city's chaos, an other cultural icon. This transport certainly does not fit into the stifling pace of the city, but maybe that's exactly why I appreciate it. As I sit back, I finally take in the streetscape I had once overlooked. The towering skyscrapers, the tightly packed tenement buildings, the smell of Hong Kong-style egg waffles wafting through the air, the rhythmic beeping of traffic lights blending into the city's soundscape. Along the journey, it's not hard to notice the unusual number of empty storefronts, hinting at a sluggish economy. Ironically, advertisements of Hong Kong's newborn panda cubs are hung around everywhere, as if it is the panacea for an underperformed economy. The tram glides through Chunyang Street in North Point, cutting through the bustling wet market, where stores line both sides of the tracks. I hop off, take a stroll, have dim sum with my family, and head home. There are a few sites that I didn't manage to visit, like the shopping mall built on the former site of Kai Tak Airport, once an iconic landing strip. Or maybe I never intended to go. These things somehow don't fascinate me anymore. They modernized old and industrial districts, yet stripped away some of the true colors of the city. With globalization thriving like never before, and the deepening connection to China, this international cultural melting pot no longer feels as distinctive as it once did. As the plane takes off, the thousands of lighted-up buildings shrink into clusters of sparkles. My hometown diminishes in distance, a quiet reminder of Hong Kong's new era, one that brings both uncertainty and opportunity. I look down, reminiscing. but the sudden plunge into the clouds veils everything from sight, nudging me to look forward.
That was Twiggy Young in Hong Kong, and that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Carole Walker and John Everard. The show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Francesca Jukes. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.